At my father's 40-year anniversary gala for Aura Care, he didn't just ruin my night, he tried to erase my existence. We were on the 70-floor penthouse of the Sterling Plaza in Manhattan, a room dripping in $50,000 floral arrangements and smelling of vintage Chanel and desperation. My father, Richard Sterling, stood at the head of the VIP table looking like the king of the world, while I sat there thinking I was finally part of the inner circle. Then it happened. As the waiter approached to serve the first course, my father reached out, gripped the back of my chair, and yanked it so violently that my heels lost traction on the polished marble. I went down hard. The sound of my body hitting the floor and my wineglass shattering echoed like a gunshot in the silent ballroom. 300 of New York's most powerful people stared at me as I lay in a puddle of Cabernet that looked hauntingly like blood. My father didn't offer a hand. He didn't even look down. He just barked at the room. "Get this woman away from my table. This seat is reserved for my real daughter, the one who actually knows what it means to be a Sterling. Before I tell you how I tore his empire down, brick by digital brick, let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from? And have you ever been the black sheep who ended up having the last laugh? Hit like and subscribe, because you're going to want to see how this audit ends. My name is Evelyn. I'm 35 years old, and I don't deal in emotions, I deal in data. As a senior criminal data analyst for the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, I spend my life staring at spreadsheets until the lies start to bleed through the numbers. I've taken down Russian money launderers and Silicon Valley unicorns that were nothing more than glorified Ponzi schemes. I know that a person can lie. A balance sheet can be forged. But the metadata never sleeps. I had spent my entire adult life trying to buy my way back into my family's good graces with good behavior. I put myself through MIT on a scholarship they didn't help with. I took a government job with a steady pension while they lived on credit and Botox. I thought if I was just perfect enough, my father would finally see me as more than the daughter of his first mistake, my mother. The woman he left for a 22-year-old swimsuit model named Margot. The gala was supposed to be Richard's crowning achievement. He was the godfather of cosmetic tech, the man who made Aura Care a household name. But as I sat on that cold floor looking up at him, the veil finally slipped. Margot, looking like a wax figure in a $30,000 gown, leaned over and hissed, "Evelyn, stop being so dramatic. You're staining the rug. Go sit at the technician's table by the kitchen. You don't belong in the spotlight." Just then, the golden couple arrived. My half-sister Beatrice swept into the room, draped in enough diamonds to fund a small war, clinging to the arm of her husband Sebastian. Sebastian was the man of the hour, a fintech visionary who claimed to have a proprietary algorithm that could predict market shifts with 99% accuracy. He was tall, tan, and wore a smirk that I usually only see on people right before I read them their Miranda rights. "Sorry we're late, Dad," Beatrice chirped, stepping over my spilled wine without a second thought. Sebastian was just closing a 9-figure deal for the Aura crypto fund. You know how it is, money never sleeps. Sebastian chuckled, adjusting his Patek Philippe. "Let the real players take their seats, Richard. We've got a legacy to build." I pushed myself up, brushing the glass shards off my dress. My husband Liam was already by my side. Liam is a federal prosecutor, the kind of man who makes defense attorneys quit the profession. He didn't say anything yet. He just stood there, a silent, looming presence in a charcoal suit, his eyes tracking every move my father made. "You're humiliating me over a chair, Richard," I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. I had stopped calling him Dad years ago in my head. Tonight the word died on my lips. "After I spent my weekend reviewing your corporate filings for the SEC audit, you were so worried about—" Richard stepped into my personal space, smelling of expensive scotch and arrogance. "You're a glorified secretary for the government, Evelyn. You track pennies. Sebastian deals in billions. You are an obligation I've fulfilled for 35 years. Now take your husband and go sit with the help. The room hummed with the sound of whispered gossip. The elite of the Upper East Side were eating this up. But what they didn't know, what Richard and Sebastian hadn't realized, is that when you invite a forensic data analyst to your party, you're inviting the one person who can see through the gold plating. I looked at Liam. He gave me a microscopic nod. We had spent the last 6 hours in our home office before the gala, and we hadn't been looking at seating charts. We had been looking at the Aura Crypto offshore ledger. Liam stepped forward, placing a hand on the VIP table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He used his grand jury voice, the one that makes the air in the room feel heavy. It's interesting you mention billions, Richard, Liam said, his voice carrying to the very back of the ballroom. Because, according to the subpoena I authorized at 4 p.m. today, the Aura Crypto Fund doesn't have billions. In fact, as of this morning, it doesn't even have thousands. The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the hum of the HVAC system. Sebastian's smirk didn't just fade, it evaporated. A bead of sweat broke out on his perfectly manicured forehead. You don't know what you're talking about, prosecutor. Sebastian spat, though his voice cracked. That's proprietary tech. You can't even access those servers. I don't need your servers, Sebastian, I said, stepping up next to my husband. I have your blockchain footprints. You didn't build an algorithm. You built a mirror. You've been using AuraCare's employee pension fund to pay off early investors in your crypto fund for 18 months. It's a classic Ponzi, just with better marketing. I looked at my father, whose face was turning a shade of purple that matched the wine on the floor. The seat isn't the only thing you've lost tonight, Richard, I whispered. You gave Sebastian power of attorney over your personal accounts last month, didn't you? Because you thought he was the future. Richard's eyes darted to Sebastian. Sebastian? What is she talking about? Sebastian didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the exit. Check your phone, Richard, Liam suggested, pulling his own device out. The SEC just issued an emergency freeze on all Sterling-affiliated accounts. That includes the gala's catering budget, the AuraCare payroll, and your personal retirement fund in the Caymans. As of 10 minutes ago, you're not a king. You're just a man in a very expensive suit with a $0 balance. The ballroom erupted. Not into cheers, but into the frantic sound of 300 socialites checking their own phones, realizing the golden investment they'd all bought into was a sinking ship. I stood there watching the man who called me an obligation realize that his legacy was currently being processed by a federal grand jury. Enjoy the appetizers, Richard, I said. Turning toward the door. I hear the Federal Bureau of Prisons does a great brunch. As Liam and I walked out of that penthouse, leaving the screaming and the chaos behind, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like the architect of a very necessary demolition. The audit had just begun. The elevator ride down from the 71st floor was the quietest 60 seconds of my life. The digital display blinked 60:45:30, as if counting down the remaining seconds of my father's public dignity. Liam stood beside me, his reflection in the polished brass doors, as steady as a mountain. He didn't ask if I was okay. He knew that for a woman like me. Okay was a luxury I traded for effective years ago. The freeze went through exactly as planned. Liam said, his voice low, vibrating with the professional satisfaction of a predator who had just closed the trap. The New York field office has agents at Sebastian's innovation hub in Soho right now. They aren't finding servers, Evelyn. They're finding empty IKEA desks and leased MacBooks. He was never a tech genius, Liam, I replied, adjusting the strap of my clutch. He was just a very good-looking distraction. My father was so desperate for a son to carry the torch that he didn't realize he'd handed the torch to an arsonist. We hit the lobby. The marble floors of Sterling Plaza were vast and cold, echoing with the clicks of my heels. Outside, the Manhattan air was sharp, biting through my silk wrap, but I welcomed the chill. It felt honest. We didn't go home. We went to the one place where I felt most powerful. My home office. It was a room filled with 3 monitors, a high-speed encrypted server, and enough caffeine to power a small fleet. While the rest of the world slept, I began the deep clean. By 2 a.m., the metadata was singing. Sebastian hadn't just stolen the pension fund. He had used AuraCare's proprietary customer database to launch a secondary scam selling VIP SkinTech memberships for services that didn't exist. My father, in his infinite arrogance, had given Sebastian root access to everything. Around 3:15 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a FaceTime call from Beatrice. I hesitated, then swiped to answer. The screen filled with my sister's face. The $5,000 makeup job was ruined by streaks of black mascara. She was in the back of a town car, the streetlights of the West Side Highway flickering across her face. "You bitch," she hissed, her voice trembling. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Dad is in the hospital. He had a cardiac event in the coat room. The paramedics had to wheel him out past the paparazzi." "If he's in the hospital, Beatrice, why are you in a car and not at his bedside?" I asked, my voice flat. She choked on a sob, which quickly turned into a snarl. "Because the club's security kicked us out. They wouldn't even let Margot get her fur coat because the account was flagged. Sebastian is missing. He vanished 10 minutes after you left. He's not answering his phone. And the police are at our penthouse. So, Sebastian is gone. Because he's a coward, Beatrice. And he's not answering because he's likely looking for a way to cross the border before the no-fly list updates at dawn." "Fix it, Evelyn," she screamed at the camera. "You're the one who works for the government. Call your friends. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them Sebastian is a genius, and this is just a misunderstanding. If AuraCare goes under, I have nothing. I can't live like you. Like me." I leaned into the camera, the blue light of my monitors reflecting in my eyes. "You mean living on a salary I actually earned? Living in a home I actually own? Beatrice, look at the seat you're sitting in. That's probably the last luxury car you'll be inside for a long time. My advice, get a public defender. Because Liam certainly isn't going to help you." I hung up. I turned back to the screen. I saw a transfer, $1.2 million, moved from the AuraCare corporate charity fund to a shell company called M-Star Holdings just 48 hours ago. M-Star, Margot Sterling. My loving stepmother hadn't just been a witness, she'd been a beneficiary. She was preparing her exit strategy while my father was still practicing his retirement speech. "Liam," I called out. He appeared at the door, a cup of black coffee in his hand. "Yeah, tell your team to look into M-Star Holdings." Margot didn't just stand by. She took a commission for her silence. Liam smirked, a dangerous, beautiful expression. "I'll add it to the warrant." The sun rose over the East River in shades of bruised purple and grey. By 8 a.m., the Sterling scandal was the top trending topic on every news outlet from the Wall Street Journal to Page 6. The headline on the New York Post was particularly brutal. "Sterling Silver turns to lead AuraCare empire exposed as Ponzi scheme." I was at my desk at the FBI field office in Chelsea, sipping a lukewarm latte when the front desk notified me that I had a disturbed visitor. I knew before I even looked at the monitor. Margot. She didn't look like the woman from the gala. She was wearing an oversized hoodie, leggings, and dark sunglasses, trying to blend in with the Hudson River joggers. But you can't hide that kind of desperation. I met her in the glass-walled interview room. She didn't sit down. She paced like a caged tiger. "Evelyn, you have to stop this," she said, her voice frantic. "Richard is stable, but the doctors say the stress is killing him. The feds are at the house. They're seizing the art, the furniture. They even took my jewelry box. It's called asset forfeiture, Margot. It happens when the assets were purchased with stolen money. I didn't know, she cried, throwing her hands up. I just signed the papers Richard told me to sign. I'm a wife, not an accountant. I slid a printed ledger across the table. Then explain M-Star Holdings. Explain why $1.2 million of charity money for burnt victims ended up in a private account in your name 2 days ago. Margot froze. The colour drained from her face, leaving her looking older, sharper. That was a gift. For my loyalty. Loyalty to what? To the lie. I leaned back, crossing my arms. You knew Sebastian was a fraud. You saw the red flags months ago, but you kept quiet because you wanted that penthouse in Miami. You traded the retirement of 500 Oracare factory workers for a down payment on a beach house. You're a monster, she whispered. He's your father. How can you be so cold? When I was 22, Margot, I was hit by a drunk driver. I spent 3 weeks in the ICU. I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that felt like ice. Richard came to see me once, not to hold my hand, but to tell me that his insurance wouldn't cover my extravagant recovery costs and that I should consider dropping out of MIT to save the family money. You were standing right behind him, nodding. You told me I was being selfish for costing the family so much. Sadja. I stood up. I'm not a monster, Margot. I'm an auditor. And today the bill is due. I walked out, leaving her sobbing in the interrogation room. 2 hours later, Sebastian was caught. He hadn't made it to the border. He was found at a cheap motel near Newark Liberty International Airport, clutching a duffel bag filled with $200,000 in cash and 3 different passports. The fintech visionary was arrested while wearing a tourist t-shirt and eating a cold slice of pizza, but the real fire started at 2 p.m. Liam and I were finishing a quick lunch at a deli near the courthouse when my home security app started screaming. My phone vibrated with intrusion detected alerts. I opened the feed. It was Beatrice. She wasn't alone. She had 2 men with her heavy-set guys in work jackets. They were inside my apartment. I watched in horror through the 4K camera as Beatrice took a heavy brass statue, an award I'd won for my work with the DOJ, and hurled it into my 85-inch television. Crack! The screen spider-webbed into 1 billion dead pixels. "Where is it?" she was screaming, her voice distorted by the camera's tiny microphone. "Where are the hard drives, you traitorous bitch?" One of the men started ripping the cushions off my sofa, while the other began spray painting the walls. Black paint. Thick, ugly strokes. "Judas," they wrote across my white minimalist walls. "Liam." I gasped, shoving the phone under his nose. His face went from calm to lethal in a fraction of a second. He was already on the phone with the precinct. "I have a 1031 in progress at my residence. Armed intruders. Suspect is Beatrice Sterling. Dispatch units immediately. My wife and I are 5 minutes out." We raced back to the apartment. The sirens of the responding RMPs, radio motor patrols, echoing through the canyons of Manhattan. When we arrived, the hallway smelled of acrid spray paint. The door was hanging off its hinges. Inside, the destruction was absolute. My home, the one place I had built with my own sweat far away from the Sterling shadow, was a wreck. Beatrice was standing in the middle of my kitchen, holding a kitchen knife she'd taken from my block. She wasn't trying to be a killer. She was having a psychotic break. She was hacking at my marble countertops, leaving jagged white scars in the stone. "You took everything," she shrieked when she saw me. "You think you're so much better than us. You're a Sterling. You're just as dirty as we are." "Drop the knife, Beatrice," Liam said, his hand slowly moving to the holster at his hip. He wasn't a cop, but as a federal prosecutor in a high-threat division he carried. The NYPD is 30 seconds away. If you're holding that when they walk in, this gets a lot worse for you. Let them come. She laughed hysterically. Dad is gone. Sebastian is in jail. I have nothing left to lose. You have your freedom to lose, I said, stepping forward. I wasn't afraid of her. I felt a strange, detached pity. You could have walked away, Beatrice. You could have claimed ignorance. But you chose to come here. You chose to make this a felony. The sound of boots thundering up the stairs filled the hallway. Police dropped the weapon. Beatrice looked at the door, then back at me. For a second, I saw the little girl she used to be, the one who would steal my dolls and break them just to see me cry. She dropped the knife. It clattered on the hardwood. As the officers tackled her to the ground and cinched the zip ties around her wrists, she looked at me one last time. I hate you, Evelyn. I wish you had died in that accident. I know, I said softly as they hauled her away. I looked around my ruined living room. The paint was still wet. The television was a black hole. My furniture was shredded. Liam walked over and put his arm around me. We can fix the apartment, Ev. I know we can, I said, looking at the black paint on the wall. But look at what she did, Liam. She didn't go for the jewelry. She didn't go for the safe. What did she go for? Oh, I pointed to the floor. Scattered among the glass shards were the printed copies of the M-Star Holdings ledgers. She had tried to destroy the evidence against Margot. She wasn't just venting, I realized. She was trying to save the only person who still has a secret account. She's still playing the game. I picked up a stray piece of paper, uncreased it, and smiled. She forgot one thing, though, I said. What's that? Liam asked. I have the cloud backup. I looked out the broken window at the New York skyline. The sun was setting, casting long, sharp shadows over the city. The Sterling name was dead. The empire was in ashes. And for the first time in 35 years, I could finally breathe the air without smelling the perfume of a lie. The audit was over. The liquidation was complete, and I was the only one left standing. The smell of acrid spray paint was still heavy in my lungs as I sat in the back of a black government SUV, the blue and red lights of the NYPD cruisers flashing against the glass of my apartment building. My home, my sanctuary, was a crime scene. But as I watched the forensic team dust my shattered coffee table for prints, I didn't feel the urge to cry. I felt a cold, clinical sharpening of my senses. Beatrice had been hauled away in zip ties, her designer heels dragging on the pavement, and as she screamed that I was destroying the family. But she was wrong. I wasn't destroying the family. I was simply performing a long overdue autopsy on a corpse that had been rotting for years. Evelyn, you need to see this, Liam said, stepping into the SUV. He handed me a ruggedized tablet. The NYPD found a burner phone in Beatrice's clutch during the intake search. She wasn't just here to vent. She was receiving instructions. I took the tablet, my fingers flying across the screen. I bypassed the simple 6-digit passcode. In seconds, Beatrice always used her birthday. I scrolled through the messages. They weren't from Sebastian. He was already in a holding cell at the 17th precinct. The messages were from an encrypted app sent by a user labeled simply as the Vault, the hard drives in her office. The hard drives in a destroy the M-Star ledgers. If those go to the feds, we all burn. Do whatever it takes. I looked up at Liam. Margot. It has to be, Liam agreed. She's the only one left with a motive to hide the M-Star Holdings connection. But look at the timestamp on the last message. I looked. It was sent at 2:15 p.m., 10 minutes before Beatrice broke into my home. She's panicking, I whispered. And when people like Margot panic, they leave digital trails like a bleeding shark in a swimming pool. We drove straight to the FBI's New York field office. I didn't want to be in my ruined home. I wanted to be in the pit, the high-tech nerve center where I did my best work. While the rest of Manhattan was heading to dinner, I sat under the hum of industrial-grade air conditioners, staring at a wall of monitors. I began a deep dive into the M-Star Holdings shell company. Margot had been clever, but she wasn't a data scientist. She had used a series of nested layering techniques to hide the $1.2 million, moving it through a defunct beauty supply company in New Jersey before sending it to a private bank in the Cayman Islands. But as I peeled back the layers, I found a secondary ghost ledger. This wasn't Sebastian's work. Sebastian's fraud was flashy, high risk, and modern. This ledger was old school. It was methodical. It was cynical. It showed a consistent monthly drain from AuraCare's research and development grants, dating back nearly 8 years. Long before Sebastian had even met my sister. Long before the Aura crypto fund was even a concept. "Liam, get over here," I called out, my voice echoing in the empty office. He leaned over my shoulder, his face illuminated by the blue light of the screen. I pointed to a series of wire transfers labeled Project Phoenix. Richard told the board this money was going toward developing a non-invasive laser for skin grafting, I explained. But the money never hit the lab. It hit a series of offshore accounts held by Richard himself. He's been skimming $200,000 a month for nearly a decade. Liam's eyes narrowed. He was stealing from his own company to fund the lifestyle Margot demanded. Exactly. And here's the kicker, Sebastian found out. When Sebastian married into the family, he must have stumbled onto Project Phoenix. He didn't report it. He used it as leverage. He told Richard that if he didn't give him root access to the AuraCare pension funds, he'd go to the SEC with the R&D fraud. So it was a stalemate of greed, Liam muttered. The father-in-law and the son-in-law were holding each other's secrets like loaded guns. Until the guns went off at the gala, I added. I spent the next 4 hours mapping the entire Sterling ecosystem. It was a masterpiece of corruption. Richard stole from the grants. Sebastian stole from the employees. Margot laundered the kickbacks, and Beatrice spent the proceeds to maintain the illusion of being New York royalty. By 4 a.m., I had generated a 150-page forensic report. It didn't just contain numbers, it contained the death warrant for the Sterling name. I hit send to the lead prosecutor on the case and the SEC's enforcement division. I leaned back in my chair, watching the sun begin to creep over the East River. My phone buzzed. It was a notification from Mount Sinai Hospital. Patient Richard Sterling. Condition stable, requesting immediate contact with next of kin. I looked at Liam. He wants to bargain. He has nothing left to bargain with, Liam said, his voice cold. But let's go. I want him to see exactly who finished him. The ICU at Mount Sinai smelled of ozone and industrial cleaner. Richard Sterling, the man who had once stood atop the Manhattan social hierarchy, looked like a broken doll. He was hooked up to a dozen monitors, the rhythmic thump hiss of the ventilator providing the only life in the room. Margot was there, sitting in a plastic chair that cost less than one of her shoes. She looked haggard. The silicone veil had finally been stripped away. Without the luxury lighting and the $5,000 a week skin treatments, she looked like what she was, a terrified woman who had hitched her wagon to a sinking star. "Evelyn," she gasped, standing up as we entered. "Thank God. You have to tell them. The police. They were at the apartment. They took my bags, Evelyn. They took my jewelry." "Their evidence, Margot," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "Items purchased with the proceeds of a criminal enterprise are subject to immediate seizure." "But I didn't know," she cried, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "I'm just the wife. Richard handled everything." "Then why did you send Beatrice to my house to destroy the M-Star files, Ishais?" Margot froze. She opened her mouth to deny it, but the look in my eyes told her that the lies were no longer working. She slumped back into her chair, her face crumpling. "I just wanted to keep my house," she whispered. "I can't go back to being a nobody, Evelyn. I can't go back to a one-bedroom apartment in Queens." "You should have thought about that before you helped Richard skim the charity funds," I said. A weak, raspy cough came from the bed. Richard was awake. His eyes flickered open, focusing on me with a mixture of hatred and desperate hope. "Evelyn," he wheezed. He tried to reach for my hand, but I stepped back. "Don't," I said. "The loving daughter act ended at the gala when you shoved me into a puddle of wine for a photo op. Let's talk business, Richard. That's the only language you ever cared about anyway." Richard's face tightened. "I made Aura Care. I gave you a name. You gave me a name that is currently synonymous with fraud and racketeering," I countered. "I've seen the Project Phoenix files, Richard. I know you started stealing long before Sebastian arrived. You weren't a victim of his Ponzi scheme. You were his mentor." Richard's heart monitor began to beep faster. "I did it for the family, to keep us at the top. No, you did it for your ego," I said, leaning over the bed rail. "You were so afraid of being seen as average that you became a criminal. And in your quest to keep the mask on, you crushed everyone around you. You didn't pay for my MIT tuition because you didn't want a daughter who could audit your books. You wanted a daughter you could control." I pulled out the tablet and showed him the live feed of the Sterling Plaza. "The board of directors just held an emergency vote," I told him. "You've been stripped of your title. The Sterling name is being removed from the building. By next week, AuraCare will be rebranded, and every penny of your remaining equity is being redirected into a victim restitution fund." Richard's eyes went wide. "My equity? That's mine." "Not anymore." Liam stepped forward, his federal prosecutor ID glinting in the harsh fluorescent lights. "Mr. Sterling, you are under arrest for 18 counts of wire fraud, 3 counts of money laundering, and 1 count of racketeering. As soon as you are medically cleared, you will be transported to a federal detention facility." Margot let out a wail of despair. "Richard, do something." But Richard couldn't do anything. He was a man with a $0 balance and a failing heart. "What about Beatrice?" Margot sobbed. "She's just a girl. She didn't mean to break anything." "Beatrice is 28 years old, Margot," I said. "She committed a felony. She's being arraigned this morning. Liam has made sure that no one in the U.S. Attorney's office is going to give her a family discount." I turned to leave, but Richard's voice stopped me one last time. It was a pathetic, broken sound. "Evelyn, what am I supposed to do?" I paused at the door, looking back at the wreckage of my family. I saw a man who had traded his soul for a seat at a VIP table, and a woman who had traded her dignity for a designer lifestyle. "You're an intelligent man, Richard," I said, echoing the words he'd told me when I was struggling to pay for my university books. "I'm sure you'll find a way to make it work, after all. Isn't that what the Sterling name is all about, resilience?" We walked out of the ICU, the heavy double doors swinging shut behind us. Downstairs, the lobby of Mount Sinai was a circus. Media trucks with satellite dishes were lined up for blocks. The story of the fall of the Sterling House had captivated the nation. It was a modern-day Greek tragedy played out in the headlines of the New York Times and on the tickers of CNBC. Liam and I moved through the crowd, our heads down, flanked by a security detail. As we reached the car, a reporter shoved a microphone toward my face. "Evelyn, are you the one who blew the whistle? How does it feel to take down your own father?" I stopped. I looked directly into the camera lens, my expression unreadable. "I didn't take down my father," I said clearly. "I simply corrected the math. And in the end, the numbers always tell the truth." We got into the car and pulled away. As we drove through Central Park, the spring leaves were a vibrant, honest green. For the first time in my life, the weight on my chest, the need to be perfect for a man who was hollow, was gone. "What's the first thing you want to do when we get home?" Liam asked, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "I want to buy some white paint," I said, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "I have some walls I need to make clean again." The Sterling Empire was a ghost. The Doi Tra was liquidated. And for Evelyn, the woman who dealt only in data, the world was finally beautifully back in balance. The audit was closed, and the future was a blank, unblemished sheet. The morning after the arrests, Manhattan felt different. The air was crisp, the sky an unforgiving shade of blue, and for the first time in my life, the name Sterling didn't feel like a weight around my neck. It felt like a ghost, a lingering scent of expensive cologne and ozone that was slowly dissipating into the city's exhaust. I stood in the center of my living room, watching the restoration crew scrape the black spray paint from my walls. The word Judas was half gone, the J and the U smeared into a grey blur. It was a metaphor for my life. The stains were deep, but with enough friction they could be removed. Liam was in the kitchen, leaning against the scarred marble countertop with his laptop open. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours, but he looked energized. The Department of Justice had officially taken over the lead on the Aura Care investigation, and Liam was the primary bridge between the FBI's data and the US Attorney's Office. "The secondary audit is hitting some snags," Liam said without looking up. "Not because the money isn't there, but because it's too there." Sebastian didn't just use a Ponzi scheme. He was running a high-frequency trading bot that was piggybacking on AuraCare's corporate credit rating to make high-risk bets on emerging tech stocks. He wasn't just stealing money, he was gambling with the company's identity. I walked over, peering at the cascading lines of code on his screen. He was using the shadow banking method. He'd borrow against the employee pension fund during the trading week bet on volatility and try to put the money back before the weekend reconciliation. He was winning for a long time, Liam, until he wasn't. "And Richard?" I asked. "Richard is still in Mount Sinai. The cardiac event was real, but the doctors say he's stable enough for a preliminary hearing via video link tomorrow. He's already hired a defense team that specializes in diminished capacity. They're going to argue he was a victim of Sebastian's elder abuse." I let out a short, dry laugh. Richard Sterling a victim? The man who used to fire executives for having the wrong shade of blue in their PowerPoint presentations. He'll hate that defense more than he hates the indictment. Being seen as weak is a fate worse than prison for him. The doorbell rang. It wasn't the police or the restoration crew. It was a courier. He handed me a thick, cream-coloured envelope, the kind of stationery Margot used when she wanted to look old money. I opened it. There was no letter, only a single gold-embossed key and a sticky note with an address in Tribeca. "You won. Everything is there. Just stop before there's nothing left to save." "M. What is it?" Liam asked, moving to my side. "Margot's Hail Mary," I said, holding up the key. "This isn't an apology. This is a bribe. Or a trap." We drove to the address, a nondescript, high-security storage facility catering to the ultra-wealthy. The kind of place where people keep the things they can't report to the IRS. As the elevator descended into the climate-controlled basement, the silence was heavy. I turned the key in Unit 408. The door slid open to reveal a room filled with the physical remains of the Sterling lie. There were crates of unreleased Aura Care prototypes, racks of Margot's vintage Chanel suits, and a small fireproof floor safe. But it was what sat on the center table that stopped my breath. It was my mother's jewelry box. The one Richard had told me was lost in a house fire 10 years ago. the one containing the only photos of her that hadn't been scrubbed from the family albums. I opened the box. My mother's emerald engagement ring sat there glinting in the harsh LED light. Beneath it was a stack of handwritten journals. She kept them, I whispered, my voice cracking for the first time. Margot kept them as leverage against Richard. I flipped open the top journal. It wasn't a diary. It was a ledger. My mother, a quiet woman who everyone thought was just a socialite, had been the first auditor. She had documented Richard's original sins, the first bribes he took to get Oracare's FDA approvals, the first time he diverted company funds to pay off a mistress. She hadn't died in an accident. She had died with a secret that Richard was desperate to bury. "Evelyn," Liam said softly, placing a hand on my shoulder. "This is the missing link. This proves the criminal enterprise didn't start 8 years ago. It started at the foundation. This isn't just fraud anymore. This is a decades-long conspiracy." I looked at the emerald ring. It was beautiful, but it felt cold. Margot hadn't given this to me out of the goodness of her heart. She had given it to me because she knew that if I found these journals, I would be so consumed by the history of the crime that I might stop looking at her current bank accounts. "She's playing the sentimental daughter card," I said, closing the box. "She thinks if I have my mother back, I'll let her keep the Miami house." I looked at Liam, my eyes hardening. "Call the SEC. Tell them we have the Phoenix Zero files. And call the district attorney. We need to look into my mother's accident in 2016. Again." The following week was a blur of subpoenas and depositions. The Sterling scandal had evolved into something much darker. The news wasn't just talking about money anymore. They were talking about the Sterling mystery, the suspicious death of the first Mrs. Sterling, and the cold-blooded corruption that had built a cosmetic empire on a foundation of lies. Beatrice was out on bail, confined to her apartment with an ankle monitor. Sebastian was singing like a canary in exchange for a move to a club-fed facility, and Margot had vanished. The storage unit was her goodbye note. I spent my nights in the FBI lab, digitizing my mother's journals. Every page was a revelation. She had been brilliant, sharper than Richard ever was. She had seen the rot early on and had tried to build a firewall to protect me. She had set up a trust fund that Richard couldn't touch, hidden under a series of maternal maiden names. By Thursday, I found it. A dormant account at a small bank in Vermont. It wasn't millions, but it was enough. It was the MIT tuition that Richard had denied me. It had been there all along, waiting for me to be smart enough to find it. "She knew," I told Liam as we sat on the floor of our half-painted living room. "She knew I'd be the one to find the numbers. She didn't want me to be a socialite. She wanted me to be the person who brought the whole thing down." "She'd be proud of you, Evie," Liam said, clinking his beer bottle against mine. "The Oracare liquidation is 90% complete. The pension fund is being replenished as we speak. The board has officially filed for Chapter 11 to strip the Sterling name from every patent." The next day was Richard's final hearing. Because of his health, the judge allowed a video conference. I sat in the prosecutor's office, watching the large screen. Richard was in a wheelchair, draped in a grey cardigan that made him look like a ghost of the man he once was. "Richard Sterling," the judge's voice boomed through the speakers. "This court has reviewed the Phoenix Zero evidence provided by the FBI. The documents suggest that your pattern of racketeering and corporate espionage dates back over 20 years. Do you have anything to say before we proceed with the asset seizure and sentencing?" Richard looked into the camera. He didn't look at the judge. He looked at me. I could see it in his eyes, the realization that his legacy was being dismantled by the very person he had spent 30 years trying to minimize. "I did what was necessary," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "In this country, you are either the hammer or the nail. I chose to be the hammer." And in the process, you broke your own house, the judge countered. This court orders the immediate forfeiture of all Sterling-held properties, including the Manhattan penthouse, the Hamptons estate, and all offshore holdings discovered in the M-Star audit. You are hereby sentenced to 15 years in a federal medical detention facility. Richard didn't flinch. He just closed his eyes. The hammer was finally broken. As the screen went black, the room fell silent. Liam looked at me, waiting for the wave of emotion, the tears, the relief. But I just felt balanced. The ledger was finally at zero. We walked out of the building and into the late afternoon sun of Lower Manhattan. The streets were crowded with people, thousands of average New Yorkers living their lives, unaware that one of the city's biggest predators had just been permanently caged. We walked toward the water, toward the Battery. I took my mother's emerald ring out of my pocket. It was a beautiful piece of jewelry, a symbol of a marriage that had been a lie. "What are you going to do with it?" Liam asked. "The ring was bought with the first bribe Richard ever took," I said, looking at the green stone. "My mother wrote about it. She hated this ring. She called it her golden shackle. Say, I didn't throw it into the river. That would be too dramatic. Too much like a movie." I put it back in my pocket. "I'm going to have it appraised," I said. "And then I'm going to donate the proceeds to the Victims of Corporate Fraud Legal Fund. It's time this ring did some actual good." We stood at the edge of the water looking out at the Statue of Liberty. The sun was setting, casting a long golden path across the harbour. "The apartment is finished," Liam said. "The painters left an hour ago. The walls are white, Ev. Perfectly white." "Good," I said, leaning my head on his shoulder. "I think I'm ready to go home." The Sterling story was over. The media would move on to the next scandal in a week or two. Richard would become a footnote in a business textbook. Beatrice would fade into obscurity. And Margot would eventually be found. But she would find that the world is a very cold place for a woman with no money and no friends. But as for me, I wasn't Evelyn Sterling anymore. I was just Evelyn. I was the woman who saw through the silicon veils, the woman who found the truth in the data. And as we walked back toward our life, I realized that the most valuable thing I owned wasn't a name or a fortune. It was the fact that my numbers finally added up. The audit was closed, the liquidation was complete, and for the first time in 35 years, the world was exactly as it should be. The restoration of my apartment felt like the slow cleaning of a deep wound. While the contractors replaced the scarred marble and the painters layered fresh, blinding white over the Judas scrawled in black, I lived in the flickering blue light of the FBI's financial crimes hub. I had become a creature of the data, a ghost in the machine, hunting for the woman who thought a private jet and a lack of extradition could save her. Margot had vanished 3 hours after Richard's cardiac event. She hadn't stayed for the prognosis. She hadn't stayed to comfort Beatrice. She had packed a single Hermes trunk with diamonds and untraceable bearer bonds and disappeared into the Newark night. "She's smart, Evie," Liam said, dropping a stack of files onto my desk at 2 a.m. "She didn't use her passport. She used a high-quality alias Marta Stanek, a Croatian national with a clean travel history. She's already landed in St. Kitts." I didn't look up from my triple monitor setup. "She's smart, but she's predictable. Margot doesn't just want to hide. She wants to live. She needs the luxury. She needs the $2,000 a night suites and the private chefs. And to pay for those, she needs to touch the money." "The M-Star funds?" Liam asked. "No, M-Star was a distraction, a sacrificial lamb she threw to us to slow the investigation." I pointed to a cascading series of encrypted transactions on the screen. "Look at the Project Phoenix metadata. There's a hidden layer, a ghost protocol. Richard wasn't just skimming for the lifestyle. He was laundering money for a secondary entity we haven't identified yet. And Margot is the only one with the biometric keys to that vault. I spent the next 14 hours in a caffeinated trance, tracing a series of fractional dust transfers. These were tiny payments pennies really moving through thousands of defunct retail accounts. It was a classic salami slicing technique designed to bypass the automated red flags of the SEC. But when you aggregated them, they formed a massive $40 million reservoir in a private bank in Basseterre. "She's logging in," I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. A red dot pulsed on my digital map. An IP address, originating from a luxury villa on the windward side of St. Kitts, was attempting to authorize a $1.2 million withdrawal to a crypto tumbler. "Liam, call the Royal St. Kitts Police Force, now." "We don't have an extradition treaty for financial fraud with them, Evelyn." Liam reminded me, already reaching for his phone. "We don't need one for fraud," I said, my voice cold as liquid nitrogen. "I just found the final piece of the 2016 insurance file. Margot didn't just sign the checks for the medical examiner. She sent an encrypted message to the mechanic who worked on my mother's car. She used the AuraCare corporate server to do it. That's not fraud, Liam. That's conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. That carries an international red notice. They'll hand her over in a heartbeat." She yeeks. I watched the active connection log. I didn't shut her out. I let her think she was winning. I watched as she moved the money from the ghost account into what she thought was an anonymous wallet. But I had already poisoned the wallet address. The moment the funds hit, they were automatically diverted into a DOJ-controlled escrow account. Suddenly, the video feed from the St. Kitts local authorities patched through to my monitor. It was grainy shot from a body cam. I watched as 6 armed officers burst into a marble-lined suite. Margot was there. She was standing by an infinity pool, a glass of vintage Cristal in one hand and an iPad in the other. She looked radiant, defiant, and completely untouchable until the lead officer kicked the glass from her hand. "Margot Sterling," the officer's voice boomed over the speakers. "You are being detained under an international arrest warrant for conspiracy to murder. Put the device down and get on your knees." The look on her face wasn't one of regret. It was pure, unadulterated shock. She looked at the iPad, realizing the $40 million she had just moved had vanished into thin air. "My name is Marta Stanich," she screamed as they forced her onto the deck. "You have the wrong person, I have immunity. You have nothing, Margot," I whispered to the screen. As they dragged her away, her Birkin bag fell into the pool, bobbing aimlessly in the turquoise water. The Silicon Queen was headed back to New York in shackles, not on a Gulf Stream, but on a federal transport plane. The news of Margot's arrest broke the back of the Sterling defense. If the family was a house of cards, Margot was the foundation, and I had just pulled the rug out from under it. 2 days later, the federal building in Lower Manhattan was under siege by the media. I walked through the side entrance, flanked by Liam and a security detail. Inside the deposition room, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and the palpable desperation of high-priced lawyers trying to save a sinking ship. Beatrice was there, sitting in the corner of the room. She looked like a shell of the woman who had shoved me at the gala. Her hair was unwashed, her eyes sunken. She was facing 5 felony counts, and she knew it. "I'll tell you everything," Beatrice whispered before her lawyer could stop her. "I'll give you the passwords to the private servers. Just, please, tell them I didn't know about the car. Tell them I didn't know about Evelyn's mother." "You didn't know because you chose to be blind, Beatrice," I said, sitting across from her. "You enjoyed the fruit of the poisonous tree for 10 years. Now you get to taste the rot." She broke. For 4 hours, Beatrice laid out the internal mechanics of the Sterling household. She described how Richard and Margot would sit in the library, laughing about how easy it was to manipulate the board. She described the cleaners, a team of lawyers and fixers, who were paid $50,000 a month to ensure that any disgruntled Oracare employee was silenced through NDAs, or intimidation. But the real show was the video link to Mount Sinai. Richard Sterling sat in his hospital bed, his face a map of broken veins and bitterness. He was under hospital arrest, with 2 federal marshals standing outside his door. His lead attorney, a man who charged $2,000 an hour to make the truth disappear, looked defeated. "Mr. Sterling," the assistant U.S. attorney began, "we have the Project Phoenix Zero files. We have your wife's confession regarding the 2016 accident. We have your son-in-law's testimony regarding the $500 million Ponzi scheme. At this point, the government is prepared to offer a life sentence in a medical facility in exchange for a full asset forfeiture." Richard's eyes flickered to the camera. He wasn't looking at the prosecutor. He was looking at me. "You think you're a hero, Evelyn?" Richard rasped his voice, sounding like glass on sandpaper. "You're just a parasite. You lived off my name for 35 years. You used my connections to get into MIT. You used my status to build your integrity. You're a Sterling. You're just as dirty as the rest of us." "No, Richard," I said, leaning into the microphone so he could hear every syllable. "A Sterling takes what they want and burns the bridge behind them. I'm the auditor who came back to count the ashes. I didn't use your name. I survived it." I opened a file on my tablet and projected it onto the room's main screen. It was a list of names, all 5,204 Oracare employees, whose pension funds had been wiped out by Sebastian's trading bot. "This is your legacy, Richard," I said. "Not the towers, not the patents, just 5,000 people who can't afford to retire because you wanted to play God with their futures. The court has already signed the order. Every piece of Sterling real estate, every offshore account, every piece of art, and every cent in your personal legacy trust is being liquidated starting at 9 a.m. tomorrow." Richard's heart monitor began to beep in a frantic, irregular rhythm. "You can't. The trust is protected. It's for my grandchildren." "There will be no grandchildren, Richard," I said, my voice devoid of pity. "Beatrice is headed for a 5-year sentence, and Sebastian is looking at 40. The Sterling name ends with you in this room on this screen." The monitor showed Richard gasping for air, his hand clutching his chest. His lawyer started shouting for a nurse, but I didn't turn away. I watched as the man who had loomed over my life like a colossus finally crumbled under the weight of his own math. The room erupted into chaos as medical staff rushed into Richard's hospital room on the screen. The prosecutor looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. "The audit is complete," I said, standing up and closing my laptop. I walked out of the federal building and into the sunlight. The streets of Manhattan were indifferent to the fall of a titan. People were rushing to lunch, checking their phones, living their lives in the messy, honest way that people do. Liam caught up to me on the sidewalk. "Evelyn, wait. The hospital just called. Richard. He didn't make it. Massive coronary. He died 3 minutes ago." I stopped. I looked at the glass towers, reflecting the afternoon sun. I thought I would feel a surge of triumph, or perhaps a crushing weight of grief. Instead, I felt nothing but a profound sense of clarity. "He died at a zero balance, Liam," I said. "That's the only way a story like his can end." "What about Margot?" "She's being processed at JFK as we speak. She'll be in a cell by midnight. Beatrice is out on bail, but she's lost everything. The penthouse is being seized tonight." I looked at my hands. They were steady. No more wine stains. No more shaking. "I want to go home," I said. "I want to see the white walls. I want to sit in a room that doesn't belong to a Sterling." As we walked away from the courthouse, I realized that I had spent my entire adult life trying to prove I wasn't who they said I was. I had been the black sheep, the disappointment, the obligation. But as the sun set over the Hudson, I understood the truth. I wasn't the one who had been liquidated. I was the liquidator. The Sterling Empire was a ghost. The Doi Tra was gone. And for the first time in 35 years, the world was exactly as it should be, in perfect, beautiful, and terrifying balance. The silence of my apartment was no longer the heavy, suffocating kind that preceded a storm. It was the clean, clinical silence of an empty cathedral. The restoration was finished. The walls were a shade of white, so pure they seemed to vibrate under the soft, recessed lighting. There was no trace of the black spray paint, no scent of the vintage Cabernet that had once soaked into the floors, and no ghosts of the Sterling name lurking in the corners. I sat at my desk, the same desk where I had spent years analyzing the crimes of strangers, and looked at the final report from the U.S. Trustee's office. The document was titled The Sterling Global Liquidation Final Distribution. It was the ultimate ledger. The numbers were staggering. The sale of the Sterling Plaza penthouse, the Hamptons estate, the collection of impressionist art, and the fleet of custom Italian sports cars had generated enough capital to stabilize the Oracare pension fund. It wasn't a full recovery. No one ever truly recovers from a betrayal of that magnitude, but it was enough to ensure that 5,000 factory workers and office clerks wouldn't lose their homes. I scrolled to the bottom of the document. The final balance for the Sterling Family Trust, $0. It's done. Evelyn, Liam said, walking into the room. He was carrying a small cardboard box, the last of the evidence files from the FBI's evidence locker. He placed it on the white desk. The judge signed the final order an hour ago. Margot is being moved to a minimum security facility in Danbury to start her 20-year sentence. Beatrice has officially checked into her community service program. She's working at a shelter in the Bronx. I looked at the box and the Sterling name. Legally scrubbed, Liam replied, leaning against the desk. Oracare has been rebranded as Vitalis Tech under a new board of directors. The patents have been placed in a public trust for medical research. The name Sterling now only exists in two places: the federal indictment records and the obituary section of last week's Times. I reached into the box and pulled out a single item that hadn't been liquidated: my mother's jewelry box. It was the only thing I had kept. I didn't want the emeralds or the gold, but I kept the handwritten journals. They were the only honest things the family had ever produced. I'm going to donate the jewelry, I said, my voice steady. The proceeds will go to a scholarship fund for forensic accounting students. I want to build an army of people who can see through the next Richard Sterling. Liam smiled, a small, proud smile. What about you, Ev? The Bureau offered you the deputy director position for financial crimes. You'd be the youngest person in the history of the FBI to hold that rank. I looked out the window at the Manhattan skyline. For 15 years, I had been a hunter. I had chased the shadows, tracked the lies, and lived in the metadata of other people's greed. I had dismantled my own family with the precision of a surgeon, and while it was necessary, it had left me feeling like a hollowed-out vessel. I'm turning it down, I said. Liam blinked, surprised. Why? You're the best they've ever had. Because I'm tired of looking for the bad, I said, turning back to him. I've spent my life proving what people are not. I want to spend the rest of it seeing what they are. I'm starting a private consultancy, Forensic Ethics. I want to help companies build systems that are impossible to corrupt from the start. I want to be the architect, not just the auditor. I stood up and walked to the balcony. The city below was alive, a chaotic, beautiful mess of millions of stories. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to categorize them or search for the hidden fraud within them. The phone on the desk buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. I picked it up. It was a photo of a small, nondescript headstone in a quiet cemetery in upstate New York. It didn't say Richard Sterling Visionary or founder of Oracare. It simply said Richard Sterling, 1968 to 2026. Beneath it, someone likely Beatrice had left a single wilting white rose. I looked at the photo for a long moment, then I hit the delete button. I didn't need the photo to remember the man, and I didn't need the grave to remind me that he was gone. He was a number that had been carried over for too long, and now the calculation was finished. "Are you ready?" Liam asked, standing at the door. Ready for what? Dinner. A real dinner. Somewhere that doesn't have a VIP list, doesn't serve $500 appetizers, and definitely doesn't have a photographer from page 6. I laughed a real, genuine sound that felt strange in my own throat. I think I can manage that. I grabbed my coat and looked back at the room. It was a white room, a blank page. The silicon veils had been torn down, and the world was visible in its raw, unfiltered truth. As I walked out and turned off the light, the apartment stayed white, reflecting the neon glow of the city. I was no longer the black sheep. I was no longer the obligation. I was Evelyn. I was the woman who had audited the world and found her own worth in the balance. The debt was paid. The ledger was closed. And for the first time in 35 years, I was free.